Thank you, Dr. Anaga, and thank you, Dr. Chitra, for including me. My slides are visible?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll be speaking on double trouble, basically diplopia evaluation and management. And when we start off thinking or having a patient coming up diplopia, this is the kind of rather complicated looking chart, but we'll go step by step. So the first question of diplopia is whether it's monocular or binocular. And part of that is actually, is it diplopia or is it just image blur, overlay of images, ghost images? Because these are sometimes which the patient may say he's seeing double, but it may just be because of other causes like refractive errors, uncorrected refractive errors, astigmatism, retinal pathologies. So first step, do a complete eye exam, refraction with centered glasses. So decentered glasses, also, or new glasses, these come with new glasses, one possible reason for diplopia. So you cover one eye and you ask whether there's diplopia. Does the diplopia remain or not? So whether it's monocular or binocular, obviously if it's monocular, you're concerned with the eye per se, and there are a lot of obvious reasons for monocular. Binocular diplopia is when all the problems start. You could have a large number of reasons for having binocular diplopia, like orbital lesions, like trauma, infection, thyroid, extraocular muscle related restrictions, paresis or palsies, neuromuscular junction defects, strabismus. We've talked about certain kinds. So like Duane's, all those are restrictive and does not really complain of diplopia, but there can be an acquired kind of a Brown syndrome or other acute comitant esotropias that can present with diplopia, and of course, nerve palsies. So is the diplopia transient or is it persistent? So transient diplopia, the most common thing we're looking at is myasthenia, a breaking forias, or migraine, which is coming on and off. Other rare ones would be superior oblique myoclonias, multiple sclerosis, and raised ICT. When the pressure rises, the patient has a sixth nerve paresis and may resolve as the pressure comes down. Always ask for variation in a recent acquired strabismus. You have a lot of tests like ICE test, which is beneficial for ptosis and not really for strabismus. And of course, a tensilon or a neostigmine test. And always ask for variability. So this patient came with an unusual looking strabismus, and you can see that just waiting itself on the morning, he came back to us and he was absolutely aligned. The dictum for myasthenia is if you cannot understand or localize the reason behind the acquired strabismus, think myasthenia. So this patient, you can't understand where the lesion is. There is multiple involvement of various kinds of muscle groups. And just a post tensilon, you can see that the patient is absolutely okay. So myasthenia is thought of the moment there is variability. If there is a persistent, constant strabismus, the common things you're looking for is acquired restrictive and paralytic. So acquired restrictive would be thyroid, trauma, and orbital infestation. So thyroid, again, not so difficult to pick up. You can have, although it can be subtle sometimes, but bilateral proptosis. Sometimes they'll just come with convergence insufficiency, which is one of the early features, because medial rectus and then inferior rectus among the most commonly affected muscles. And loss of vision can actually occur if there is exposure or optic nerve compression. And you can see on imaging fusiform enlargement of the extraocular muscles, which is tendon sparing. So pseudotumors are going to have involvement of the tendon and very large with fat striations, but just fusiform enlargement of the extraocular muscles without any significant fat striations. And look for orbital optic nerve compression if there is deterioration of vision. The other cause of acquired restrictive strabismus can be cysticercosis or infestation in the orbit. And this patient presented to us with an acquired Brown syndrome. We'll have Shashikan tell us details about Brown's, but just to show you this patient, you can see the dip in adduction and the limitation of elevation adduction and elevation and adduction. And the moment we imaged, you found a cysticercosis sitting on the superior oblique tendon. So the patient was managed with medical management and did not require any surgery. Paralytic strabismus can present as a polyneuropathy or mononeuropathies. And if you have a multiple cranial nerve palsy, your first most important thing is to localize the lesion and do appropriate investigation. So in this case, you can see third, fourth, B1 was also involved, and a sixth nerve palsy along with mild proptosis, pain, fever. So you're thinking of a cavernous sinus thrombosis or a Tolosa-Hunt syndrome. And it actually turned out on imaging to be a maxillary carcinoma invading the orbital apex. On palsies, you need to do an examination. You look for head postures, which can be helpful. The patient can adapt it. to avoid diplopia or sometimes to actually accentuate the diplopia in a sense so that he's able to ignore the second image. But usually it is to have an area of binocular vision as large as possible. You look for 9 gaze deviations. Where is the deviation maximum? And of course, a diplopia charting. Generally, diplopia charting, you would want to do red-green glasses. So, use red-green glasses, use a slit in front of your torch so that the patient can also appreciate torsion and is able to tell you the actual separation between images. So keep the slit vertical for horizontal diplopia measurement and horizontal slit for vertical diplopia measurements. Third nerve palsy, you can have major causes. Most commonly, we are worried about aneurysms. And of course, the most common cause is ischemia like diabetes, hypertension. So that's how they will present some of the key findings of diplopia charting in third nerve palsy is a crossed diplopia with a vertical and horizontal component. The more important thing is there is a switch in the type of diplopia. So the red image is higher looking up and lower looking down because the eye cannot go up or down. So these are important signs, or on history, you can easily pick up the type of squint that the patient has. It's important to neuroimage some of these patients where the pupil is involved, or even if it's a partial third nerve palsy with sparing of pupils, because it could be an evolving third nerve palsy. So we need to worry about aneurysms. So MRI plus minus an MR angiography is something that you're looking for. Like this case, a complete third nerve palsy involving the pupil turned out to be an aneurysm. A partial third nerve palsy sparing the pupil may turn out still require imaging, but it's pupillary sparing are often because of vasculopathic factors like hypertension, diabetes, and needs a detailed systemic workup. Fourth nerve palsy trauma is the most common, the other being congenital or idiopathic. And of course, they will complain of torsional diplopia. That is the key thing that you will pick up. And 9 gazes or a 3-step test and an ipsilateral head tilt will tell you the increase in hypertropia would be diagnostic of a superior oblique palsy, along with torsion seen on fundus exam. A 6th nerve palsy will give us uncrossed diplopia with the diplopia maximum on the side of the problem, and that's how they will present.
60 seconds.
And the management of any diplopia would be occlusion, prisms, drugs, Botox, or surgery. Prisms can be helpful, but usually they cannot, because there is a variable diplopia in different gazes, they may create a problem. Medical management, we've talked about for myasthenia or thyroid, and including cysticercosis, so albendazole may be required. Botulinum toxin, particularly for 6th nerve palsy, is an early intervention, will help to rehabilitate the patient and overcome the risk of contracture of the antagonist. And you wait for at least 6 to 8 months to make sure that the deviation is stabilized before you plan for surgery. And the aim is to give the largest area of single binocular vision, but often you're not able to restore complete binocularity. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Rohit. That was nice and successful. Dr. Murli, you have some questions?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Rohit. So I have 2 questions. One is like, how soon would you give botulinum toxin to patients with 6th nerve palsy? Would you? So how soon would you give botulinum toxin? Like, is there a waiting time? One, and secondly, how often is it that you get glaucoma hardware or buckles and patients presenting with diplopia?
The first question on botulinum toxin, so I usually wait for at least a month, because particularly in vasculopathic issues, you would have significant improvement in the beginning, but I would not want to wait too much longer, because then once the muscle goes into a contracture, then I would have, then the effect of the botulinum toxin is not going to be significant. So I follow up in the first 1 month, and if there is less than satisfactory or significant improvement in the diplopia, I would think in terms of going for botulinum toxin. And thanks to our retina colleagues who are doing more and more vitreous surgeries, we are seeing a definite decrease in the number of buccal-related problems. But yes, that is a major problem. The other sometimes advantage may be that the patient does not gain that much vision after a rather major retinal surgery that patient complains of, major diplopia, but it can be cosmetically unsightly. And so it can be a problem. And we've had one case where when we tried to remove the buccal, there was so much scleral thinning underneath that it actually tended to give way. So we had to actually put a a scleral patch graft before we could do anything. So that was really unfortunate because especially if there's a buccal infection, the sclera underneath that becomes very thin. So sometimes you're not able to do anything for that and you're looking for transposition procedures, which can be a problem. But as I said, thankfully, they are much less than what we used to do, say, some 10 years ago.
The expert panel, other speakers, any questions for Dr. Rohit?
Dr. Sujata, you'll have to unmute.
Yeah. Yes. Am I audible?
Giving Botox, do you prefer?
So a newer entity which is now giving rise to diplopia, I have had 2 patients, will be the accommodation excess which is being brought about by excess of screen use, device use. I have had 2 children who have come with diplopia following excessive
Screen use.
Screen use. And about the botulinum injection, the FDT also would be a useful guide as to when you can give your toxin. Of course, we wait for maybe 1 or 2 or 3 weeks, but then if it starts becoming a little tight, then the botulinum toxin it is probably better to give the toxin before.
There's one more audience question for Dr. Rohit, not related to this talk. That is, how has your practice changed in COVID times? I mean, any particular precaution for pediatric ophthalmology per se?
So we took out the guidelines for pediatric ophthalmology. A lot of the esteemed faculty here were part of those COVID guidelines. And yes, it's become rather difficult. It's not been an easy job. Parents are also reluctant, and unfortunately, children are not who can be easily coaxed about masks and social distancing and things like that. It's been more, we've changed more to adapt technology to us. So I actually ask parents, even when they take an appointment to come, ask them to take a lot of photographs and send me, so that, especially when I'm doubtful about strabismus or I'm worried about the kind or the frequency of strabismus, I get an idea. And so the contact time or the evaluation time has decreased. Our time to spend with the child has decreased. The toys and all which we used to actually play with them has decreased. Of course, along with the number of patients who have come, who are less. But in the end, you have to spend time with the patient to actually to be able to assess the deviation, especially if you're planning any form of intervention. So I guess as surgical interventions increase with time, we will have to at least try to adapt in some way, maintain distance, but be able to do the complete assessment. But yes, I would say we're trying to adapt technology to help us to assess better.
On a
Can I ask a question?
lighter note, I think the view of the fundus view has become rather hazy with all the face shields and protective glasses and mask fogging. I think that is also, but so, that's on the line.
Very true. Thanks a lot.
The child can get done. I take a fundus photograph.
Next.
Yes.
Can I ask a question, ma'am?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, especially now in the times of COVID, how often are we using the online fusional exercises, especially that Binox and those softwares that we have? Is it increased now or have always been being used in the last so many years?
I think just to answer that question, that DVD we always offer to the patient. If you want to do it at home with a fixed number of sessions which are there loaded on that software program. Probably, I haven't looked at our data, but probably more people are opting for doing it at home than some people used to come to for in-office thing. They will come for 10 days, 2 sessions each, and then. But I think that part is now, a lot of it is being done at home, and it's easy also, and you can track it also. Actually, the newer softwares have a inbuilt tracking, so that you can know whether the patient has done the exercise or not, and it actually sends the data back. I don't know if it's a privacy violation, but it is there. It's inbuilt in that. So it's a good idea actually, to rather than stepping into the hospital.
Thank you.
Now